It started, as these things often do, with something small, something accidental, blown entirely out of proportion by a neighbor who saw herself as the rightful ruler of our quiet cul-de-sac. My wife, Sarah, and I had only been in the house for 8 months, drawn to the mature trees, the friendly waves from porches, and the promise of a stable, peaceful community regulated by a seemingly innocuous HOA. We were the types who preferred keeping to ourselves, focused on making our new home comfortable and establishing our lives there. We read the HOA covenants cover to cover, intent on being good neighbors and compliant residents. We painted our mailbox post the approved shade of black, kept the lawn meticulously edged, and ensured our trash cans were out of sight on non-pickup days. We believed in following the rules, assuming everyone else did too, or at least, played by the same reasonable understanding of community living. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you believe homeowners should have rights, not be bullied by power-hungry neighbors, hit that like button and subscribe for more. We were settling in, finding our rhythm, when the first subtle signs appeared. Mrs. Gable, who lived directly across the street and served as the self-appointed, perpetually re-elected HOA president, had an uncanny knack for noticing everything. A garden gnome slightly too visible, a delivery truck parked for 20 minutes too long, a shade of paint on a window trim that, while perfectly within the approved palette, was apparently too loud for her taste. These were usually delivered via pointed comments shouted across driveways or passive-aggressive notes tucked into our mailbox, always signed ambiguously as a concerned neighbor. We initially brushed them off, adjusting where necessary, assuming she was just particular. Sarah thought she just missed having children to micromanage. I just wanted to avoid conflict. But what she discovered next would force her to choose between keeping the peace and defending her property rights. Our house sat on a corner lot, slightly larger than the others, with an older, established oak tree near the property line that provided much-needed shade in the summer. We'd invested a significant portion of our savings into this property, seeing it as a long-term home, a place to build our future. We envisioned peaceful evenings on the porch, weekend gardening projects, the kind of quiet security that comes from owning your little piece of the world. The HOA, on paper, seemed designed to protect these very things: property values, neighborhood aesthetics, community harmony. Mrs. Gable, a woman in her late 60s with a tight perm and an even tighter grip on the HOA checkbook and rulebook, presented herself as the guardian of this harmony. She spoke often in community meetings, which were sparsely attended, giving her uncontested authority about maintaining standards and preventing undesirable elements, code, we suspected, for anything that deviated from her own rigid vision of suburban perfection. She controlled the narrative, she controlled the budget, and she controlled the interpretation of every single covenant. We heard whispers from older residents about how things used to be before she took over, how neighbors helped each other, how kids played freely. Now, it felt like living under a low-level surveillance state, albeit one focused on lawn height and mailbox colors. Mrs. Gable, we overheard her telling another board member once, believed the HOA existed not just to enforce rules, but to guide residents toward better choices about their own homes. It was a revealing phrase, chilling in its casual assertion of control. The real trouble began on a Tuesday afternoon. We were having some work done near that old oak tree. It wasn't major construction, just tree trimming and some trenching to run a new irrigation line, well within our property lines. We'd checked the HOA covenants. Minor landscaping and utility work within one's own lot didn't require approval, only structural changes or additions. The crew was professional, marking utility lines before digging. It was a completely unforeseen accident. A small feeder line, unmarked on the utility maps and buried shallower than regulations typically required, was nicked by a shovel during the trenching. There was a flash, a pop, and the power went out on our side of the street. We immediately called the utility company. They were already aware and dispatched a crew, explaining the old, unmarked line was the culprit and it was a known issue they were working to map better. It was an unfortunate incident, but easily fixable and no fault of ours beyond the sheer bad luck of hitting an anomaly. Within minutes of the power going out, Mrs. Gable was across the street, hands on her hips, face a mask of outrage. "What have you done?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the downed crew tools and the inactive utility pole. We tried to explain, calmly, that it was an accident, the utility company was fixing it, that the line was unmarked. She wouldn't hear it. "You deliberately cut the power," she accused, her voice rising. "This is unapproved work. You've damaged community property." We pointed out it was a utility line, not HOA property, and the work was on our lot. She didn't care. I'm fining you. You'll pay for this. This is exactly the kind of disregard for rules that damages our property values. She was already shouting about calling the HOA lawyer, about putting a lien on our house, about how we were disruptive troublemakers. Her reaction was so over the top, so completely disproportionate to an accidental utility issue that was already being handled by the power company, that it jolted us. This wasn't about a power line. This was about control. It was about her need to exert dominance, to punish us for perceived transgression, however minor or accidental. It was the first time we saw the true extent of her entitlement, the raw, unbridled power abuse masked as HOA enforcement. Later that day, a formal, printed violation notice appeared in our mailbox, citing unauthorized and destructive property modification, demanding a hefty fine within 24 hours and threatening further action. It was absurd. This wasn't a simple fine for a minor infraction. This felt punitive, personal, and completely unfounded. That notice, tacked to our mailbox, felt like a declaration of war. My initial reaction was shock, then frustration. Sarah was upset, questioning why someone would be so deliberately cruel over an accident. But beneath the frustration, a spark of something else ignited, a quiet determination not to be bullied. We carefully took down the notice, photographed it, and placed it in a folder. This wasn't over. The pressure from Mrs. Gable didn't ease. The power was restored within hours, and the utility company confirmed in writing that it was an accidental hit on an old, unmarked line, fully covered by them, and that our contractor had followed all proper procedures for marking known lines. We presented this to Mrs. Gable, hoping reason would prevail. It didn't. She dismissed the utility company's statement as their problem, not the HOA's, and insisted we were liable because the work was unapproved, even though the covenants didn't require approval for this type of work. She doubled down on the violation notice, adding threats of daily escalating fines if the initial one wasn't paid. She began circulating rumors, telling other neighbors that we were irresponsible, that we had intentionally damaged property, that we were driving down home values. We felt a shift in the neighborhood dynamic. Friendly waves became hesitant nods. Conversation stopped when we approached. We were being socially isolated, a tactic she clearly used to apply pressure. We knew then that this wasn't something we could reason our way out of. We needed help. We started documenting everything. Every interaction with Mrs. Gable, every note, every shouted accusation, every violation notice, legitimate or otherwise. We took time-stamped photos of the property before, during, and after the work. We got written statements from the utility company and our contractor detailing the accident and their procedures. We dug deeper into the HOA covenants and bylaws ourselves, comparing them line by line with Mrs. Gable's demands. We quickly found discrepancies. Her fines were often outside the stated fee schedule, her procedures for issuing violations didn't match the bylaws, and her interpretation of approved modifications was far stricter and broader than the document allowed. The HOA required architectural review for external structural changes, not landscaping or utility work on private property. This was crucial. She was operating outside the scope of her authority. Next, we quietly consulted with a lawyer specializing in HOA law and property rights. It was an expense we hadn't planned for, but the potential cost of giving in to Mrs. Gable's demands and establishing a precedent for her control over our property was far higher. The lawyer confirmed our suspicions. Mrs. Gable was indeed overstepping her bounds. The initial violation was likely invalid based on the covenants, the fine structure was illegal, and her threats of liens were baseless without following strict legal procedures that she clearly hadn't initiated correctly. He advised us to continue documenting and to cease direct communication with Mrs. Gable regarding the dispute, instead routing everything through official written correspondence referencing the specific covenant articles she was misinterpreting or violating. This was empowering. We weren't just homeowners guessing. We had legal backing. The more we pushed back, politely but firmly, demanding justification under the covenants and bylaws via registered letters, the more erratic Mrs. Gable became. She seemed genuinely shocked that we weren't immediately caving to her threats. At a poorly attended HOA meeting we decided to attend, she brought up the power incident, distorting the facts wildly, portraying us as reckless destroyers of neighborhood infrastructure. When we attempted to calmly present the utility company's statement, she declared us out of order and had a fellow board member, who looked deeply uncomfortable, threatened to have us removed. Her control was absolute among her small, hand-picked board, who seemed either afraid of her or beholden to her in some way. Her tactics escalated. Suddenly, we started receiving violation notices for minor issues that had never been a problem. Our trash cans were visible for an hour too long after pickup. A single weed was spotted near the curb. The color of our mulch was deemed unapproved. The mulch color wasn't mentioned anywhere in the covenants. These felt like desperate, petty attempts to find anything to fine us for, to bury us in paperwork and financial threats. We documented each one, noting the date, the alleged violation, and the lack of basis in the actual covenants. We started noticing cameras appearing on Mrs. Gable's property, pointed directly at our house. She was watching us, waiting for any perceived misstep. During one heated exchange over the mulch, standing just inside our property line, Mrs. Gable crossed into our yard, pointing and shouting. "You think you can just do whatever you want," she screeched, her face inches from mine. "I am the HOA. I decide what happens in this neighborhood. You will comply, or I will make your lives miserable. I will fine you into bankruptcy." It wasn't a moment of frustration. It was a clear, undeniable assertion of absolute power and an explicit threat. This wasn't about rules. It was about bending others to her will. That was the moment my quiet determination solidified into an unshakable resolve. We were no longer defending against a few unfair fines. We were defending our right to live peacefully on our own property against a bully using the HOA as her personal weapon. Our methodical preparation continued. We compiled a binder overflowing with evidence, photos, dates, times, copies of the covenants and bylaws with relevant sections highlighted, registered mail receipts, the utility company report, the lawyer's initial consultation notes. We even spoke to a couple of other neighbors who had quietly suffered under Mrs. Gable's arbitrary rule. They were hesitant to get involved publicly, but offered whispered encouragement and confirmed her pattern of behavior. We learned that Mrs. Gable had effectively silenced any opposition by controlling meeting agendas, refusing to provide financial reports, and intimidating anyone who questioned her. We had the evidence of her procedural violations, her financial opacity, and her abuse of power. We had built a solid case, but we needed the right moment, the right mechanism, to use it effectively. We knew confronting her directly at an HOA meeting would be futile. She would simply shut us down. We needed an external force, an authority she couldn't ignore or manipulate. Then, during a casual conversation with a longtime resident who felt trapped by Mrs. Gable's regime, we learned a crucial piece of information. The small rental house Sarah and I owned on the other side of town, a property we'd bought years ago as an investment and managed ourselves, was currently rented by a sheriff's deputy. Not just any deputy, but one who had risen through the ranks, a quiet, professional individual we knew simply as Mr. Evans, who was highly respected in the local department. He'd been a reliable, low-maintenance tenant for over 3 years. It clicked into place. Mrs. Gable loved calling the police for minor issues, noise complaints that weren't noise, parking violations that weren't violations, even once calling because a teenager was skateboarding on the sidewalk. She used law enforcement presence as another tool of intimidation. What if she called the police on us, and Mr. Evans was the one who showed up? It was a long shot, but the possibility offered a potential turning point. We didn't plan to engineer the situation, but we prepared for it. Our lawyer had advised us on how to handle interactions with law enforcement if contacted regarding HOA matters, calmly explain the situation, present documentation, and explain the history of harassment. We decided to add a discreet note about the sheriff deputy tenant to our lawyer's file, just as background context, never imagining it would play the decisive role it did. We continued to live our lives as normally as possible, meticulously following every actual HOA rule, documenting every false accusation, and waiting. Mrs. Gable, emboldened by our lack of visible counterattack and mistaking our strategic silence for defeat, grew increasingly arrogant, pressing forward with demands for the fabricated fines related to the power incident and threatening legal action herself. She seemed certain she had won. This overconfidence was her fatal error. The day the situation came to a head was ironically anticlimactic in its initial moments. Mrs. Gable, apparently frustrated that we hadn't paid her bogus fines or responded to her latest flurry of fake violations, decided to escalate. She called the police, reporting property damage and ongoing harassment related to the power incident from weeks ago, exaggerating wildly about dangers and costs. She likely expected the police to show up, issue us a warning or citation, and thus validate her authority in the eyes of the neighborhood. What she got was Sheriff's Deputy Evans pulling up in his cruiser. We saw the cruiser pull up and felt a surge of nervous energy. Mrs. Gable was already outside, waiting, practically vibrating with self-importance, ready to brief the officer and point us out as the problem residents. Deputy Evans approached our house, calm and professional. Mrs. Gable immediately intercepted him, launching into a loud, theatrical complaint about us, the irresponsible homeowners who destroyed property and refused to cooperate. She painted a picture of us as unruly scofflaws. Gesturing towards our property, demanding he take action. Deputy Evans listened patiently for a moment, his expression neutral. Then, he politely but firmly interrupted her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "I need to hear their side of the story." He then turned and walked towards our porch. Mrs. Gable was visibly stunned by this deviation from her expected script. She sputtered but followed him. As Deputy Evans approached, he gave us a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of recognition that momentarily disarmed our anxiety. We invited him in. Mrs. Gable hovered on the porch, peering in. We calmly explained the situation, the accidental power line incident, the utility company's report, Mrs. Gable's subsequent campaign of harassment and fabricated violations, the actual HOA covenants, and our attempts to resolve it through proper channels. We didn't editorialize or get emotional. We simply presented the facts and, crucially, the binder. We laid out the meticulously organized binder on our dining room table. "We've documented everything," Deputy Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. "Every violation notice, every communication, photos, the utility company statement. We even highlighted the relevant sections of the HOA covenants and bylaws where her actions violate procedure and exceed her authority." Deputy Evans began flipping through the binder. He saw the photos of the power line, the utility report confirming the accident, the stack of increasingly petty and unfounded violation notices, the section of the covenants detailing architectural review, which clearly didn't apply to utility work, the bylaws outlining the actual procedure for issuing fines, which she hadn't followed. He saw the pattern of abuse, the clear evidence that Mrs. Gable's claims were not only exaggerated but actively false, and that she was misusing her position for personal vendetta. He looked up from the binder, first at us, then out towards Mrs. Gable, who was still trying to listen from the porch, her earlier confidence replaced by a look of confusion and growing unease. Deputy Evans then did something we hadn't anticipated, but which was incredibly effective. He stepped back out onto the porch, with Mrs. Gable still there, and spoke in a clear, level voice that carried slightly across the quiet street. "Mrs. Gable," he began, addressing her directly, "based on the documentation provided and my review of the situation, it appears this is a civil matter regarding the HOA covenants and bylaws, not a criminal one requiring police intervention for property damage or harassment. As you reported," he held up a copy of the utility report. "The power company confirms this was an accidental hit on an unmarked line during authorized work on private property, and they handled the repair. There is no evidence of criminal damage." He then gestured to the binder. "Furthermore, the homeowners have provided extensive documentation suggesting the subsequent violation notices you've issued may not be in accordance with the HOA's own governing documents and procedures." Mrs. Gable's face went pale. But they cut the power. They're destroying the neighborhood," she stammered, her voice losing its commanding tone. Deputy Evans remained calm. "Ma'am, my role here is to address your report of a crime. There's no evidence of a crime. What I see here is a dispute over HOA rules and enforcement. These homeowners appear to be well informed about their rights and have followed procedures to document their situation." He paused, then added, the full weight of his office behind the quiet words, "False reporting, however, is something the sheriff's department takes seriously." He then delivered the final, crushing blow, though not in a dramatic reveal, but as a simple, factual statement in response to her continued sputtering about her authority. "As it happens, Mrs. Gable," he said, looking her directly in the eye, "I am also a resident of this county, and these homeowners are my landlords for a property on the other side of town. I can personally attest to their character and their diligence as property owners." The air went out of Mrs. Gable as if she'd been punched. Her jaw dropped. The realization that the authority figure she had summoned to crush us was not only sympathetic to our plight, but had a personal, positive relationship with us, based on our responsible behavior, was devastating to her. She had painted us as irresponsible destroyers, and the very sheriff's deputy she called for backup knew firsthand that we were responsible, law-abiding citizens and good landlords. Her carefully constructed narrative imploded. She stood there, momentarily speechless, before attempting one last, weak assertion. You can't interfere. This is an HOA matter. Deputy Evans nodded. Precisely. It's an HOA matter, not a police matter requiring criminal charges. My presence here confirms that your report was unfounded. I suggest you address your grievances according to the HOA's dispute resolution process, assuming your actions comply with your own bylaws. These homeowners have clearly done their homework. He then turned back to us. Thank you for your time and for providing the documentation. If she continues to harass you or trespass, please contact us again. We have a record of this visit and her report. With that, Deputy Evans gave us another brief nod and walked calmly back to his cruiser. Mrs. Gable was left standing on our porch, alone, exposed, her power stripped away not by shouting or drama, but by quiet preparation, irrefutable evidence, and the simple, unexpected truth of a landlord-tenant relationship. She finally retreated back across the street, not with a triumphant stride, but with slumped shoulders, disappearing into her house. In the immediate aftermath, the silence felt profound. Deputy Evans' visit and his public correction of Mrs. Gable shifted the dynamic entirely. Word travels fast in a neighborhood, and seeing the sheriff's department validate our position and implicitly rebuke Mrs. Gable chipped away at her aura of invincibility. Our lawyer proceeded to send a formal letter to the HOA board, including Mrs. Gable, outlining the numerous procedural violations, the baseless nature of the fines, and threatening legal action if the harassment and false violations didn't cease and the existing ones weren't rescinded. Faced with concrete evidence and the public dismantling of her authority by law enforcement, the rest of the board, sensing a losing battle and potential personal liability, finally acted. Mrs. Gable was quietly removed as president and from the board entirely within weeks. The bogus fines were voided. Our rights to conduct work on our property, within the actual covenants, were implicitly reaffirmed. Standing on our porch in the days that followed, looking out at our property, no longer under constant hostile surveillance, a sense of hard-won peace settled over us. We had defended our home, not with aggression, but with diligence and strategy. The neighborhood dynamic was permanently altered. The illusion of Mrs. Gable's unquestionable power was broken. While the old easy friendliness might take time to return, we had established clear boundaries. We were the quiet neighbors who didn't make a fuss, but who also wouldn't be bullied. Our property was ours, truly ours, and we had proven we were willing and able to defend that fundamental right. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more stories about standing up to HOA bullies.